So
the thing we
let's
have
get
to
to this.
remember, one final point, let me just say one final point on this, Shannon, because I think it's important. Consistently, what you've seen in 2016 and 2020 is that the media uses fake polls to drive down Republican turnout and to create dissension and conflict with Republican voters.
Donald Trump running mate JD Vance likely expected a softball interview from the Fox propaganda network when he sat down with them earlier today. But the Fox host in question actually broke JD Vance's heart with a series of brutal fact checks about the current polling reality for the Trump campaign. And in his desperation, JD Vance also blew the dust off an old Donald Trump scandal that he probably doesn't want in the press. But before we unpack all that, if you end up liking this video and you want to support the channel, please be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and alert bells before you go. All right, friends, we have several clips to talk about in this video, and they are all wildly entertaining. As a reminder, JD Vance is Donald Trump's running mate. He is wildly unpopular, perhaps the least liked vice presidential running mate in the history of America, and certainly considerably less popular than Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, who is running as Vice President Harris's running mate. So with all that in mind, JD Vance goes to a safe space. He goes to the Fox propaganda network and is probably wanting, a security blanket. But Shannon Bream, the Fox News host, actually, and good on her for doing this, doesn't really provide him with one. So we're going to play the clips and unpack it together.
I mean, our Fox News polling does show the economy is the #1 issue and that people do give you all the edge on that. And yet, this is what we have out from some new polling out of the New York Times. They say Ms. Harris is now leading Mr. Trump among likely voters in Arizona, 50-45, and is even edged ahead of Mr. Trump in North Carolina, a state Mr. Trump won 4 years ago, while narrowing his lead significantly in Georgia and Nevada. What is the administration doing, the campaign doing with that data as it comes in? I mean, these are critical states that you got to have a path to 270. Are there any pivots? Are there any, reconfiguring of what you're doing in the strategy? Because you talk about your message, but is it not landing?
Well, let me say two things about this, Shannon. First of all, the polls tend to radically overstate Democrats. We certainly saw that during the polling of summer of 2020 and summer of 2016. And, of course, a lot of those polls were wrong when it came to Election Day. The second thing I'll say, Shannon, is what we have certainly seen is that Kamala Harris got a bit of a sugar high a couple of weeks ago. But what we've actually seen from our own internal data, Shannon, is that Kamala Harris has already leveled off. If you talk to insiders in the Kamala Harris campaign, they're very worried about where they are because the American people just don't buy the idea that Kamala Harris, who has been vice president for 3.5 years, is somehow going to tackle the inflation crisis in a way tomorrow that she hasn't for the past 1,300 days.
So as you can see there, and the clip gets worse when she keeps pressing the issue on polls. As you can see there, JD Vance begins with poll denialism. Like, listen, I don't trust the polls. The polls are wildly off kilter. I should say that JD Vance and Republicans have not been alone in offering that excuse when they're down in the polls. The fact of the matter is that every presidential campaign, every political campaign uses polls. So this idea that you should throw polls out because they are occasionally inaccurate, it's ridiculous. They are snapshots in time. And JD Vance and Donald Trump could potentially change things between now and the election. But the fact of the matter is ignoring the polls, particularly when the polls are overwhelmingly consistent, as they have been, is like ignoring the check engine light on your car. It may still start. You may still get from point A to point B, but you really are rolling the dice. If you ignore it, you ignore it at your own peril. So in this second clip, JD Vance starts to unravel a bit more when Shannon Bream continues to press him.
How does that not line up then with another poll we got out this morning? Washington Post, ABC, they're giving the vice president nationally a 4 to 5 point lead over. I mean, those are new numbers. So if you think the momentum is not swinging or your internal polls are suggesting differently, every other poll that's been released has shown great momentum in her direction.
You know, Shannon, I think there are a lot of polls that actually show her stagnating and leveling off. Of course, ABC Washington Post was a wildly inaccurate pollster in the summer of 2020. And look, if you see the numbers that we're seeing and you actually talk to the American people, I feel extremely confident that we're going to be in the right place come November. We can't worry about polls. We have to run through the finish line and encourage everybody to get out there and vote. But our message is going to be very simple. If you want to get back to the peace and prosperity, the rising take-home pay, Donald Trump delivered it once, and he can do it again. If you want to double down on the failed policies that have delivered higher food prices and higher housing prices, well, Kamala Harris has been vice president for 3.5 years, and I guarantee she's going to make the problem worse if the American people give her a promotion.
So
the thing we have to remember, one final point, let me just say one final point on this, Shannon, because I think it's important. Consistently, what you've seen in 2016 and 2020 is that the media uses fake polls to drive down Republican turnout and to create dissension and conflict with Republican voters. I'm telling you, every single person who's watching this, the Trump campaign is in a very, very good spot. We're going to win this race. We just have to run through the finish line.
Okay.
So it got so bad, the denialism got so bad that it actually spawned into a miniature version of what Trump does all the time. The polls are fake, and actually the fake lamestream media uses the polls to what? To suppress Republican voter turnout, to sow dissent among your ranks. You all are pretty good at creating dissent and dissension among your own ranks, right? Because Donald Trump is a malignant narcissist. Donald Trump is also an idiot, and Republicans who actually want to win elections and are not fully subsumed into the cult of personality take issue with that. But you see what he did there? He started out okay in terms of handling the bad news, and then it progressively got worse to the point where he felt the need to interrupt Shannon Bream to drop a Trump-style mini rant about conspiracy theories, fake polls, and the mainstream media, instead of actually addressing the issue. Now, I said at the beginning that JD Vance actually blew the dust off a Donald Trump scandal. And he did in an attempt to dunk on Democrats. Okay, so he brought up a name that is closely associated with Donald Trump. And you probably, given all of the issues that are currently plaguing the Trump-Vance campaign, you probably don't want that name back in the media spotlight because it won't be too long before people remember, hey, wait a minute, isn't that a Donald Trump associate? See if you catch it.
Giving Kamala Harris control over inflation policy, Shannon, it's like giving Jeffrey Epstein control over human trafficking policy. The American people are much smarter than that. They don't buy the idea that Kamala...
So to, again, go for like a salacious comparison that I think he thinks will hurt Democrats, he references Jeffrey Epstein, deceased sex trafficker, and then appeals to the intelligence of the American people. Well, if that's true, then the American people are probably smart enough to remember some of these things about Jeffrey Epstein and your boss, your cult leader, Donald Trump.
So like Chairman Aguilar said, we hear a lot from our constituents on different issues, but something I've heard that doesn't seem to be being covered are the Epstein files. These files were released, and like Donald Trump sort of all over this, right? There are pictures of him with Jeffrey Epstein. He's taken multiple plane flights with Epstein with young girls on board. He is in call logs with Epstein. One of the highest trending hashtags on Twitter right now is about Trump and Epstein. I'm not going to repeat the hashtag because we're in a dignified setting. But yeah, y'all might want to look at that because that's highly disturbing. And again,
it is highly disturbing. That's Democratic Congressman Ted Lieu reminding the press of the myriad salacious connections, disturbing connections between Jeffrey Epstein, deceased sex trafficker, and Donald Trump, current cult leader of the Republican Party. And Lieu was pretty direct. But you know who was even more direct? Jared Moskowitz, Democratic Congressman, who used satire and irony and visual aid to pummel Republicans over the head with this particular connection.
And so, again, because the gentle lady from Georgia, I know is such an advocate for women's rights, as she mentioned, and is so concerned about grooming, and apparently we don't have any standards here anymore. Again, I just want to remind my colleagues, because, I don't want them to forget about hypocrisy, okay? I don't want them to forget about hypocrisy. But, Donald Trump was asked about Jeffrey Epstein. And when he was asked, he said, Jeffrey likes him young. Well, how did the president know that? How did he know that Jeffrey Epstein likes him young? Perhaps some people are saying he was there since you're so concerned, right? But again,
hilarious that Jared Moskowitz would use this. Again, Democrats are constantly accused of being groomers and pedophiles, an evil party of groomers and pedophiles by the Republican Party, and all manner of sexual deviant. And yet Donald Trump, not Vice President Harris, not President Biden, Donald Trump is the one who is a known close associate of Jeffrey Epstein, deceased sex trafficker. So again, I'm not sure why JD Vance would drop that name at that time, because it just might provoke the American people who have a very short attention span into, oh my God, speaking of Jeffrey Epstein, isn't JD Vance's boss and cult leader and running mate? Weren't they like BFFs, Epstein and Trump? That will certainly not help JD Vance's floundering campaign or the floundering campaign of his boss. But there you have it. Of all people, the Fox Propaganda Network actually giving JD Vance a bit of a rough interview with a series of brutal fact checks about the current polling reality. And JD Vance going from, listen, it's no big deal, the polls are fake, to the polls are totally fake. The mainstream media are manufacturing these fake polls, and they're just injecting them constantly in order to suppress Republican voter turnout and to turn us against each other. Like, okay, buddy. Within a 5-minute spread, he goes from like this calm, cool tech bro, billionaire populist into a ranting, raving, frothing at the mouth conspiracy theorist because he can't cope with the reality. Great stuff. Let me know what you think in the comments.